So we can all talk about philosophy and nod our heads and talk amongst ourselves like this in a podcast. But if you do not take action, think about what happened to Vin Zhang. It's twice your life that you're wasting. And why do you want to waste life at 60, 70, 80 when you're on your deathbed? Why do you want to even regret what you didn't do tomorrow? Make the change today by trusting your intuition.
What's going on, guys? It's Yahavy, David, St. Clair Speak. You are now tuned in to the St. Clair Speak Show.
You are now tuned in to the St. Clair Speak Show.
What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the St. Clair Speak Show podcast. I'm your host, Yahavy St. Clair. Guys, we have another incredible guest. Guys, we are sitting down with Sunil Godse, CEO and founder of Radical Solution Group. Sunil, I want to welcome you onto the St. Clair Speak Show podcast. You have a very in-depth background, and I'm excited to learn a little bit more on, how you're helping business owners with branding. What is branding now in 2022, and how can we develop a better, stronger brand? Sunil, please give our listeners a 3 to 5 minute introduction of yourself, your brand, your business, and of course, what brings you onto the St. Clair Speak Show podcast.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Yahavy, for inviting me onto this podcast show. Looking forward to diving deep into the intuition weeds, so to speak, and why I've come to try and understand what intuition is and what it has to do with business. And this is what this podcast interview is all about. And so I'm the CEO of Radical Solutions Group. And what I do is something called intuitive branding. And what intuitive branding does is it helps business owners unleash the power of intuition, which is something that they're born with, to create a trusted brand with their employees and customers. And it does this in under 14 seconds. And this is what the research shows. And so when you have a trusted brand in the eyes of the employees and customers, what you're going to find is that highly talented people want to stick around with you, to work with you. Your customers who are fiercely loyal want to continue to buy from you, and that strips them away from your competitors. And that's what happens. When that happens, you eliminate your competition. So essentially, intuitive branding is leveraging or unleashing the power of intuition to create a trusted brand that eliminates your competition in under 14 seconds. And I've got case study upon case study upon case study where I've actually implemented this in other companies. And they've gone on to pummel their competitors and just kind of leave them way behind. And the reason why I kind of got into this is I've started a bit of a career in helping other businesses, starting a number of businesses on my own. And the backstory of that is me actually getting into engineering. So ignoring my intuition to get into engineering, which I didn't like. And so for those watching, I'm a South Asian male. So it's doctor, lawyer, engineer, or failure. There's only 4 career doors you have. And when I got into engineering, I really didn't like it. And I was getting this nudging to say, you're better suited for business. And it made sense because when I was 5 years old, I remember there's my dad telling me that I couldn't buy these video games I really desperately wanted, but they were too expensive. And I remember this voice telling me to go door to door to raise money. And that's exactly what I did at 5 years old. I raised $200. $100 went to my dad and the other $100 went to charity. So this entrepreneurship was in me. And yet I ignored intuition. I call intuitive signals. I just completely ignored them to go into engineering. Yet I remember something nudging me to go back to entrepreneurship, and I quit engineering. And I started running businesses, and I made $20 million over the next 5 to 6 ventures before moving on to consulting. And so what I've learned when I started doing consulting is that I had these nudges of what the problem was that I needed to solve. And each and every single time, these nudges were correct. And so when I reflect back, when you look at 2020, which is, hindsight is 2020, I'm going back and saying, wow, okay, what were all these nudges that were telling me what the right decision was to help these companies fix their problems? And the formal introduction, or the formal way that I kind of took a deep dive into intuition is right after I wrote my first book called Fail Fast, Succeed Faster. And the premise of that book was that if I can start documenting stories of failure, then conceptually, if you're reading stories of failure from others, then you shouldn't have to repeat them because somebody else has already made those mistakes. And so you should be able to succeed faster. And so when I went on stages across North America and worldwide to talk about my book, it was, the one question I would get is that, Sunil, can you tell me what's the one thing that's going to get me to entrepreneurial success? And at that point I said, oh my God, okay, I've got a 400-page book here. I didn't come here with a cue card or a one-page PDF. Like, there isn't no one answer to your question until I went back to the audio recordings. And when I went back to the audio recordings, 80 to 90% of the people had said, I ignored my intuition. I ignored my gut. I knew what the right decision was, but I ignored it to some degree. And when I finally realized that there was this thread of intuition going through the success and the failures of those in my book, that's when I took a deep dive into understanding intuition, the complex nature of it, and how it related to business. And that kickstarted my second book called Gut. And then that's when I started intuitive branding, when I started to say, okay, how is intuition positioning itself in making the decisions when it comes to business, and what's most important? And when I looked at those businesses that were running very successfully, it was the relationships that they had with their employees and customers that kept them there. And we've all been there. How many times have we known that this is the boss I love working for, or this is a company that just don't resonate with their values, and you instantly know that you don't want to be there, or you instantly know yet you want to stick around for the long haul, or that your long-term growth, they care about your long-term growth, or if you're buying their products and services, they're filling a need or increasing value in your life or solving a problem. Whatever the case is, the reason why you make those decisions to stay around with a company, or the reasons why you make the decisions to buy from a company, is purely emotional in nature. And that's tied to your intuition. And so when I looked at intuition, that's how it works. And so when I looked at the science of it, when you are establishing trust in a company, or with a company, either as an employee or as someone who's buying your products and services, that trust starts in as little as 33 milliseconds. And by the time your intuition is able to say, hey, listen, it's okay to work for that company, it's okay to buy from that company, that takes up to 14 seconds. And so that's how quick it is. And so what I do now is I go into companies and I take a look at the problems that they're having, if they're having problems, and 99.9% of them are stuck. But I help business owners make the decisions first to start earning the trust of their employees and their customers, and breaking that down into a series of steps into a number of business areas like leadership, marketing, sales, operations. We even look at the data, we look at team building, we look at scaling, and how intuition plays a role in making the decisions in each of those areas to make sure that your employees and customers feel valued. And then when you make those decisions, the employees are the ones that are going to move your business forward. And your employees are the ones that are going to attract the customers. And then we've got internal productivity increases, and you've got external revenues coming in. You've got a winning formula in business.
Man, there's a lot. There's so many different directions I could go from there, and there's a lot to unpack. So the first thing I kind of want to touch on, you talk about, intuitive decisions. And do you believe that in order for someone to make these decisions, they have to be consciously aware of just where they're at, not just in business, but in life?
Yes, because intuition does not know the difference between your personal life or your professional life. And what's been happening to a lot of people is we get so scurried, and we want to hurry. We want to have everything quickly. We want to blow up on YouTube, or we want to stop the scroll on Instagram, or we want to continue to have something very quick, or we just get our head down in doing what we do on a day-to-day basis, that we don't take a chance or the time to take a step back and listen. And so if I go into, let's take a look at intuition and break it down. And the reason why you want to sit back, stay back and listen, because it's very important. When I talk about intuition, it's actually quite complex, but it behaves in a very simple way. So it's like driving a car. Let's say you're driving a car, you push a button, you hear the engine whir, or turn the keys if you've got an older car. And if the engine is sounding really good, you simply take off. And so from if I use that same analogy to intuition, your intuition sends you these things called intuitive signals. And so earlier I was talking about these nudges that was going to me. And I talked about the voice that I had when I was 5 years old. So it turns out that intuition sends you one of two types of signals: positive signals to tell you to go ahead with the decision, or negative signals to tell you to back away from that decision. Okay. And so an example of a positive signal for me is that the dots are connecting or feeling sort of a sense of flow. And these signals are very unique to each one of us because, your experiences are going to be very different than mine. And so to give you an example of a signal that's really way out there is there's a CEO that I interviewed who sees an omen pop up on his right shoulder. Doesn't know, no color, no shape. But when he sees this omen pop up, he says yes to whatever business deal that is in front of him. And to date, he's run 2 multi-million-dollar businesses based on this omen that's popping up. If we look at the other side, the negative side, which is your negative intuitive signals, my negative intuitive signal, the very first one, is that I lose a sense of my focus. It becomes super clear. I lose my peripheral vision and I get hyper-focused. My eyebrows cross. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's something in front of me that's going wrong. It just could be that the decision I'm about to make is wrong. And what happens with your negative intuitive signals is that they actually start very subtle in nature. And then as you continue to ignore those initial signals, they start to get louder and louder until you can no longer ignore them anymore. So there's one person I interviewed for my podcast series, and she was in an abusive relationship. And she knew right from the very start, her intuition was just whispering at her to get out of the relationship. And it got so bad that she kept ignoring it. She got rashes, headaches. And finally, after a number of months, she actually heard the words "get out." And she finally kicked this guy out. But by that time, she was financially devastated, $80,000 in the hole after having $250,000 in her bank account before. And another CEO this guy was running a 9-figure mortgage company on top of the world, 300 employees, no problems from an external perspective. Yet his intuition was saying he needed to leave, and he kept ignoring that nudging, as I called earlier, until he was in the back of an Uber one time and the words just blurted out, "You're quitting." That's it. It just came out. He had no control over it. And he finally realized. He went to the board and he says, "I'm quitting." And, he's at the top of his game. And they were just like, "Why are you quitting?" And he quit. And so for him, it was the absolute right decision. The mortgage company actually tanked about 6 to 9 months later. And he got out. And so his intuition was bang on. So the reason why I was saying that we need to take a step back and listen is because we have to cut out the noise to listen to these intuitive signals that come that are positive and negative, and they're telling us what the right decision is to make in that particular business application or even in your personal life. Now, that's the simple part of intuition. Let's now get into the complexity of intuition. There's 4 types of intuition that drive these signals. And the best way that I can describe this, if we look at that car analogy, if Yahavy, you and I are driving the car, we don't need to be mechanics to make it run, right? We don't have to pop open the hood and know that there's gears and, compression ratios and where there's the oil, et cetera. We just drive the car. But from an intuitive perspective, when you pop open the hood, we have these 4 types of intuition. And the best way I can describe these 4 types of intuition is by going through a case study of how I took a non-believer to a complete believer in intuition in 1 hour. So one of the first interviewees I had when I was going through sort of forming intuitive branding was a fellow by the name of John Rothschild. This guy was a 25-year veteran in the investment banking industry. This guy, data, spreadsheets, That's all he knew. So when I phoned him up and said, hey, listen, John, I want to do this interview on intuition. At that time, if you Googled intuition, you had things like manifestation, you had things like coming from the cosmos, voices from God. And it's okay if you define intuition like those. If those are your signals, that's fine. But for him, he says, come on, Sunil, like intuition doesn't exist. What are you talking about? And he said, look, I'll give you an interview anyways. You're my friend. I haven't seen you in a while. So let's sit down for an hour and we'll talk about this thing called intuition for about 5 minutes, and then we'll just catch up. So I'm driving down to see him, and I'm thinking, oh my God, this is going to be a real short interview. And so I set up my camera, I turn it on, and I tell him about, that CEO that saw the omens. And I also tell him about another CEO who has his unique negative signals. His left earlobe gets hot. So whenever he makes a bad decision. And so John, you can see, is rolling his eyes. He's going, Sunil, come on. You know what? I would love to shake the hands of that guy who sees omens, but listen, every decision that you make, especially in business, is based on your learning and experience. And so now let's start diving into the 4 types of intuition. One of the types of intuition is actually called experiential intuition. So if you look at your brain like basically an iceberg, 90% is below water. That's the subconscious part of your brain. And the 10% above water is the conscious part of your brain. And so what happens is every single time when you're born, you go through about 5,000 to 6,000 experiences per day. And when you're older, 28 to 35,000 experiences per day. And so what your intuition does is it takes those pieces of information and starts putting them in the subconscious area of your brain like a library. And so whether it's a good decision or a bad decision, when you're young, you have 5,000 to 6,000 good and bad decisions you're making, 28 to 35,000 good and bad decisions that you're making. And they're putting that year in, year out into the subconscious area of your brain. So by the time you make a decision, you've got billions and billions and billions of data points that your intuition is going to draw from to let you know that the decision you're about to make is going to be the right one or the wrong one. So if it's the right one, your intuition is going to go into your library saying, oh, Sunil, you made that right decision before in the past and it worked out for you. I'm going to send you a positive signal to go ahead with that decision. Or conversely, if it says, Sunil, I remember 6-8 years ago that type of decision didn't work for you, yet you're about to make that same decision again, I'm going to send you a negative signal. And so it sends you a negative signal. I have to be able to sense that. And so when I talked about experiential intuition with John, I was saying, well, John, sometimes your intuition will have you go against the data. And he goes, well, that's funny, Sunil, you mentioned that. So John was in the business of putting franchise locations in. So if you have a McDonald's or a Dunkin' Donuts, what his team would look at is a scale of 1 to 10 to say, listen, if we look at the traffic patterns, if we look at the development in the area and the demographics, we're actually going to put a franchise location here or not. And so his team looked at this one place in Toronto, Canada. It was a crappy place. And his team says, okay, out of a scale of 10, it's going to be a 5.5 out of 5. And the only ones they approve are 9s or 10s, obviously. So John goes to this crappy area of Toronto. He looks at the data and he looks at the sort of what's in that area. This is now the second type called situational intuition, where you're looking at the situation that's around you. And so many of us I'm sure all of us have kind of walked into that room and we said, something's off. That's your situational intuition working for you. So John's looking around and he says, now, and I have on film saying this now, I think that we should be putting a location here. Perhaps it's my intuition. I'm not sure. So at least I've got him to say the word intuition, but he actually goes against the data, throws away the data, and he actually puts a location there. That particular location, that franchise was called the Beer Market. that was the most successful franchise location or franchise name out of his whole portfolio of brands of franchises because he went against the data. And then the third type is called relational intuition. And in John's case, there's a time when obviously John was an investment banker for 25 years, as I talked about earlier, but his purpose changed. He said, I no longer want to be working for someone. I want to actually be a coach. I want to run a business. And so what relational intuition does is that it gets you to only listen to those people who truly care for your success. They're not going to be yes people. They're there to give you constructive criticism, but they're going to be in your circle through thick and thin. And in John's case, when he made the announcement that he actually wants to run a business, all the people around him that were concerned about money, fame, ego, private jets, high-end restaurants, all of them said, you're nuts. Only one person actually even bothered to ask him, John, why do you want to do that? And that was his wife. And now I'm paraphrasing. This is now about 45 to 50 minutes in the interview. And he says, Sunil, you can have all the data in the world, but sometimes you have to trust your intuition. And I looked at my wife and I said, this just feels right. There was his intuitive signal. And then the fourth of the four is called creative intuition. Creative intuition is how much risk are you willing to take in that decision? So obviously, if you're eating a sandwich or turning left at the lights, not very creative. Your creative intuition is very low. But in John's case, you would think John's intuition with his background was saying, hey, listen, we're going to hand you a business with some amazing cash flows, strong balance sheet, healthy revenues. Not his intuition. His creative intuition is saying, no, John, you know what? Here's a tiny bankrupt little restaurant for you, my friend. You run that. And he trusts his intuition, walks into that tiny bankrupt little restaurant. That tiny bankrupt little restaurant ended up being Eastside Mario's location number one. And over the next 20 years, he grew that into a $2 billion behemoth with over 1,000 franchise locations under different brand names, all because it felt right. That's the complex nature of intuition. That's the power of intuition. Those are the intuitive signals that we have. And now if we circle back to the question about why we need to pay attention, that's why we need to pay attention to our intuition, is because these four types of intuition are each sending you a positive signal or a negative signal. And the reason why we now ignore our intuition is because we are naturally stronger in one of the four based on our past experience and how we've made decisions in the past. And so that's great, but it also means that we're weaker in the other three. And when we are weaker in the other three, we can't sense their signals. And so let's say the one that you're strongest in. So let's say, Yahavy, you're strongest in experiential intuition, and you have a decision that looks great from your experience perspective. There's a positive signal coming in. But let's say your relational intuition, which you're weaker in, is saying there's some guy there that you can't trust because your intuition's picked up on some behaviors. You better back away from that decision. But because you're weaker in relational intuition, you miss that negative intuitive signal and you go in business with that guy. And then you lose your shirt because you didn't take the time to strengthen the other three types of intuition. That's what I do with intuitive branding, is I strengthen the other three types of intuition so that you can understand where all your signals are coming from. Then you're prepped for every decision to make because your intuition, all four, are now letting you know whether it's the right signal or not. And you're able to hear or sense all the four types of signals coming through.
Ooh. Woo. Oh man. Okay.
That's a lot I threw there.
And I'm glad you did. I'm glad you did the way you did, because the last guest I interviewed right before you said something, and it kind of like rolls over. There's a difference between listening and hearing.
Yeah.
And I think that falls in line with intuition as well. You touched on a story about your friend. Just, it was bottled up for him to quit, and it just came out. I didn't even mention this to you prior. I was working this full-time insurance job. This was literally a couple of weeks, and I've been with them for a couple of months now, and it was a full-time remote job, and I hated it. And I talk about this all the time about paying attention to how you feel when you do things. Let me tell you about this podcast. Okay, now you feel my synergy has changed, but that kind of falls in line with experiential intuition of just knowing how I feel when I podcast. Man, you are just like, okay. All right, let me get my train of thought, because what happens here with me is I get really, really excited. And you said something too. Just in passing, I catch these things about your purpose changing. I love how you touched on that, because my purpose changed. You also talked about experiential intuition. I just mentioned it. But for me, I was at a road still, and with, do I want a podcast? Do I just want to get back in personal training full time? And my experiences was telling me, oh yeah, just do personal training, so what you've done it for a decade now. But the relation intuition and the situational intuition was leading in me doing the podcasting full time, because my purpose changed. I love how you touched on that. Number one, I'm glad I asked the question about just being aware. And you touched on something too about, I believe it was, being aware of your relation intuition. So what relationships and, who is for you and who's not for you. I tell you this, usually there's sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But there was this one time that something in the universe came to me and said, Yahavy, there was this one particular guest I needed to vet. I never vet people, never. Usually I'd vet you 5 minutes before. And for her, I had to vet her. And we got on the call. This is the first time me ever sharing the story. And she was sharing a short story. And I'm glad she went down that rabbit hole. It was her choice of words that just threw out some red flags, using words of choices like you people, and this is why they do this and that. And I was just like, yeah, this is not going to work out for us. It just didn't work out. I could just tell the type of person she was. And I'm glad that I paid attention and I was aware to catch that, because if I would have let her get on my show, that would have just kind of like blew my show off the hinges, because you're someone I don't want to spend my time with. And I really do honor people's time, and I honor this wholeheartedly. I'm the type of person where I wear my emotions on the sleeve. If I would have caught that live, I know I would have said something on the spot, which is cool. But I'm glad I caught that, because I learned in the moment, number one, when my intuition is telling me something, and like, if I'm going to ignore those red flags, I'm going to pay for it later. Man, this is really good. And like, we just started.
Thank you for streaming this episode of the St. Clair Speaks Show podcast. Don't forget to visit stclairspeaks.com and order your copy of my first book, Sweats to Suits, available now in Kindle and paperback edition. If you want to be my next guest, or my next guest, give me a referral, and I will sponsor your business in an ad segment just like this. Visit stclairspeaks.com and learn more about the St. Clair Speaks Show podcast proposal. It's that time.
Yeah, and let me tell you about
go ahead.
Yeah, and so there's something, and you bring up a really good point, and I want to kind of jump off of that point, is that you pay for it later. And there's something that I always talk about called opportunity cost. And the opportunity cost is the cost, not just the cost of you ignoring you basically not trusting your intuition and moving your life forward. It's also the cost of you ignoring your intuition and the cost of you leaving yourself behind. And the best way I can crystallize that is through another story of another podcast guest of mine, Vin Giang. And Vin Giang is an international keynote speaker. And back in 2016, he's also a magician. He was speaking to 100,000 people across 80 stages around the world, making 7 figures. Everything on the outskirts was looking good. Downtown apartment in LA, major brands all over, hobnobbing with the supposed hobnobbers. From an extrinsic motivation, ego perspective, he was living the high life. And then his intuition was bubbling and bubbling and bubbling. And finally, in 2016, his intuition he finally had a signal that he couldn't ignore, saying, you need to fix something now or you're done. So he tells his wife, I got to fix this. I got to fix this. And so he takes off to New Zealand, no cell phone services, this Airbnb in the boonies. And he just takes a bunch of pens and, some notepads and stuff like that. And he starts putting up these, what he thought were his values on his wall, what he thought he was all about. And he looks at these values and he says, oh my God, this is what my wife wants. This is what my manager wants. This is what society wants. This is what my customers want. Where the heck is Vin here? Where am I? And he starts taking them down and he spends the time to think, okay, who am I? What do I really want? And he starts writing them down and he starts putting those up on the wall. And what he was saying is that what he thought would be a cathartic moment, what he thought would be refreshing, was actually haunting, because for the first time ever in his life, he was stepping up to the plate to be himself, live life according to his rules. And so he goes through this cathartic experience, comes back from New Zealand, a renewed guy, and he falls back in the same old pattern again. And for 6 months, hobnobbing with the hobnobbers, running around with brand names, you stroking his ego. And 6 months later, his parents come up from Australia and his mother pulls him aside. And they're Vietnamese. And so he says, my mom had this Vietnamese saying that struck me right to the core. And she said, when you hang around squid, you're going to get a lot of ink on you. You have a lot of ink on you, my boy. This is not my boy. And that particular intuitive moment, or intuitive wake-up call moment, as I call it, had him finally make the decision to say, I am not acting like who I really want to be. And so he sold all his brands, sold the downtown, cut everybody out of his life, moved to the suburbs, and he felt finally free. And so after Vin was telling me that story on the podcast, what I told him, and here's where the opportunity cost comes in. You spent 6 months trying to right that wrong. So from an opportunity cost perspective, it's not just the 6 months that you lost because you ignored your intuition. It's also the 6 months that you could have gained if you had trusted your intuition. And if you're in the business of helping 100,000 people a year improve their lives, how many people did you disappoint? How many people did you leave behind? And he said, I've never thought about it like that, Sunil. And that's what happens when you ignore an intuitive signal. It is always 2 times the cost or worse. And let's say you have the courage and you want to move ahead. One of the biggest hurdles to people actually moving ahead is something called fear. Fear of success, fear of failure, fear of the unknown, fear of change. That's fear. When intuition pushes you to move your life in a place that you're a little bit uncomfortable because it's new or it's novel, like you're doing the podcast or what have you, it's different. But if it's paired with an intuitive signal, yeah, you could be fearful of it because you've never done something like that. But a positive intuitive signal saying, you got this, man, because somewhere in the past, you've done it. You've done something like this. You've had the courage, you've had the strength, you've had the will to make a really difficult decision in the past. Why is today any different? And so that fear stops a lot of people. And one of the people I interviewed was a guy by the name of David Dame. And he was in a wheelchair all his life because of cerebral palsy. This guy used to go to the beaches and used to always have his wheelchair parked in the back, always wanting to feel, what does it feel like when that sand and water go through your toes? But he feared being embarrassed. He feared being in a wheelchair and being wheeled. What are people going to think? And one day his intuition got so loud, said, David, you got to do it, man. Now's the time. So he finally says, I'm going to listen. He gets wheeled by his wife and the people who are helping him to the edge of the sand and water barrier. That sand and the water caressing his toes and his feet. Loved it. And so they stand him up, and his biggest fear came through. He fell flat on his face. And that fear came up again. What are people going to think? I'm looking dumb. I look stupid. I can't believe what I just did. How could I, why do this? And then an intuitive signal came out that's saying, come on, Dave, you can take a step in the ocean. And he recognized that signal as a positive intuitive signal. In the face of fear, he takes a step into the ocean. And then his intuitive signal says, you can take another step, Dave. And he takes another step, and he takes another step. And pretty soon the water gets up to his chin level. And then he turns around because he was being present every step of the way. And when he turned around, that's when he realized how far he had come. So when you take the time to be present in that moment, listen to your signals, you keep taking the steps, even in the face of fear. Because what happens is you'll suddenly realize you've gone much farther than you think. That's the power of intuition.
Yeah, love that. I want to ask you something. And I was, one, that was really, really good because you got me scrambled here. Whenever I'm scrambled, it's really good. So I take a lot of notes whenever I interview. So I wrote down, there's something you mentioned earlier in terms of just helping companies and corporations, earn trust and establish trust. How does, because my initial thing was, okay, what's the conversation like? What's the training like? Because, with lack of trust comes micromanaging, right? And I wanted to ask you, my question now kind of like changed. How do you learn how to trust yourself after being wrong, right? You mentioned so much, but how can you learn to trust you again after not listening into your intuition before? How do you kind of like build that and get that going again?
Yeah. So the very, very first exercise that I have everybody go through, whether it's in business or in personal life, is to take stock of their intuitive signals. And so the first thing you do is, what are the right decisions you've made on one piece of paper? What are the wrong decisions you've made on a second piece of paper? And what you want to do is, for every right decision, you want to write down, what did it feel like in that moment? And for every wrong decision, you do the exact same thing. But in the wrong decision piece of paper, what you want to do is you want to make sure that the wrong decision you make, is that decision number 1, or is that decision number 4? Was there a decision before that was wrong that led to that decision, and so on and so forth? Because you want to get to the original decision that was wrong. Because if you make a mistake in that, let's say you and I do that exercise, and let's say we both have this gut feeling, right? And for you, it's signal number 1. And let's say I'm just lazy and I think, oh yeah, it's signal number 1 for me, and I really haven't done the work. So when we both get that gut feeling, for you, it's signal number 1. You're going to ignore it. You're going to move away from that decision. Who cares about the what if situation? For me, I'm going to wait for that gut feeling. Says, oh yeah, my intuition has told me to take a step back. But for me, if that was signal number 4, I've ignored signal number 1, 2, and 3, which means I made 3 bad decisions. Those 3 bad decisions could be me just stubbing my toe on the side of a door, or my business headed towards bankruptcy. I just don't know. So when you take stock of your unique inventory of signals, now at least you're able to sense the majority of your signals coming through. And that's always step number 1. So when you're going to micromanage, when you're going to be an authoritarian in the workplace, you know that that's not what you should be doing. Your intuition knows that that's not how you treat people. And so many people have been to enough seminars or watch YouTube videos or seen stuff on social media that your intuition knows that's not what you do. And so your intuition will always give you a signal to say that's not how you treat people, or they simply leave, right? And for those CEOs or business owners who haven't taken the training in intuitive branding, the reason why they do this is because in some cases they can't notice those signals, right? Because they're weaker in those three intuitive types. And so when they're weaker in those three intuitive types, they're going to continue to be nasty when it comes to being a leader. And so now remember, intuition is a two-way street. So it's not only what your intuition is doing to make decisions, it's also the intuition of others looking at you. So if you're going to treat people badly, it takes the intuition of others under 14 seconds to notice that you're treating yourself badly, or to notice that your actions don't match your words, or to notice that you don't care. And then you go from wanting to work for that person to wanting to look on job boards to move somewhere else. Your productivity starts to go down. You don't give two hoots about the company and you leave. And so you could be a highly talented person that wants to work for someone, but that other person, it's very clear that they don't care for you to work for them. And that's what happens with employees when you get this mass exodus. I mean, we have this mass resignation now, which is gone. And from my perspective, people are just starting to stand up to say, listen, I want to work for someone who actually has values, who actually cares. And if you look at the statistics with the Gen X's, the Y, the Z's, the alphas, the actual number of years in a company is going down 3.9, 3.2 and less, because they've got these older models of managing people and they're not working anymore. And people care. People want to have values. If you're going to run a company like that, you're going to lose up to $1.3 trillion in losses because of lost productivity, employees leaving you, or customers fleeing. 96% of customers flee because of a bad customer experience. 96%. They just need one excuse to leave and they go to your competitors. And way too many businesses are being run the wrong way. And so with the case study that I had one company just exactly like that in the healthcare company, two co-CEOs, nobody trusted them. They were on the way down. I came in to fix things. Very first thing I said is, you guys have to take a step back. And so they were running, their cash was really low. What do? Increase the salaries of everybody because they were underpaid. So that's my first thing as a consultant was doing that. And so now they're saying, oh my God, I think we hired the wrong guy. But that trust that I gained, just because all I did was I gave them market rates plus a little bit more. But I asked them, how do we fix this company? And I listened to what they wanted to do. And I implemented what they wanted to do. And so when I listened to the employees, they were so stuck with me and what I wanted to do. They were so helpful that anything I needed, they would go above and beyond to help me. And what ended up happening is that not only did we stabilize the company because everybody cared, but I was able to now go on an expansion hunt, and they were able to worry about the operations and make their operations as efficient as possible. And so by year 2, we were now up to $3.5 million from a struggling $400,000 thing in the healthcare company, in the healthcare space. And we started getting calls from all the healthcare providers around that city saying, what are you guys doing? Our employees want to work for you. And because they were in the healthcare space, getting physiotherapy and massage, their competitors were losing their customers because they're all coming to our facility, and they're booking in droves because we had such a friendly atmosphere that we had friends coming and they're telling friends. And so we kind of sucked up the customers from everybody else in the area, and 5 or 6 of them went bust. And to give you a sense of comparables, in that particular, like a massage therapy, physiotherapy business, on average in Ontario, Canada, you were making anywhere from $250,000 to maybe $400,000 top end per location, maybe. We were booking $1 million plus, and we had our competitors just peel away. And I left after year 3 because my contract was done, and I gave them a $10 million gift for expansion. And here's what happens when you don't trust those. After I left, The two co-CEOs came back and they didn't learn a thing. And they went back to the same old ways that they were doing. Changing contracts, actions didn't match words, lying, blatantly lying in some cases. That $3.5 million company that had a runway of a guaranteed 10 million if they followed my advice imploded in 6 months.
I want to ask you something. You said this twice, even in your story, when you reference your friend and this company. You mentioned they went back to their old ways. I want to ask you, why do they initially just go back to their old ways? It just made me think of my manager used to tell me this all the time, my old fitness manager. Don't be going back to your old ways. Is it like already instilled and retrained in our brain? If so, how long does it take for us to break out of those habits? Because in those two case scenarios, they initially went back to doing what they shouldn't have done. I want to know why.
Yeah, and there's a variety of reasons. There's going to be ego. There's going to be fear. Sometimes they're just way too rational. Sometimes they just don't care. Right? They don't want to change. And to actually have change, it's easy to make that decision to change, but there's always that afterthought of what are they going to think, or I'm not used to this, or it's a little uncomfortable, whatever it is. So it's rare that people actually go back to doing or to do something different. But in the one case, with David Dame, I mean, he's now trusting his intuition all the time. Vin Jiang, after that 6-month marker, he is now doing everything of what he wanted from an intuitive perspective. Everything. He's completely changed his business model. He's moved back to Australia from the US. And so now he just wants to live his life in the present moment. And so very few people are standing up for themselves and doing that. And it can be tough, but it's because people are ignoring their intuition. And it also now comes back to these 4 types of intuition, of which 3 of them are still weaker in. So they haven't had the proper training yet to really kind of bolster those 3. And so what my role is going to be from a content perspective is to start talking about these 4 types of intuition a lot more and how it seeps. And even if you look at, Stanford's, Steve Jobs' Stanford address, very, very famous address that he did at Stanford, which he talks about intuition. One of the pieces of video I'll be doing is actually looking at the 4 types of intuition and highlighting, as he's talking about his intuition, how he talks about the 4 types of intuition. Right. And so, J.K. Rowling in her production of Harry Potter, in her actually making Harry Potter, was based on intuition. Right. I don't know if you know that story. She was in a train. She wasn't even writing for that. And there was a download, an intuitive signal that got all the characters on this train ride, all the characters. And from there, Harry Potter was born. And then she intuitively knew that she was going to get rejected. She just had to push on. And she did get rejected until one person took a chance on her, which she already knew. And she did this interview on Oprah, and she talks about this publicly. And that was it. The rest is history. Jeff Bezos talks about intuition. Richard Branson, Sarah Blakely from Spanx, which she just sold, all talk about intuition. Oprah on intuition. Martin Luther King Jr. intuition. I mean, his "I had a dream" speech was not part of the written speech. He had a whole written speech, and his intuition got him to throw that all away. And his first 4 words were based on intuition. I have a dream. The Wright brothers, starting flight. Somebody else was trying to develop these wings like chicken wings coming in, and they looked at, it's not about moving the air. It's about how you control the air. Because they were in bicycles, they were looking at how gears had this chain, looked at the gears. They said, well, what if we did this to wings on a plane and we control that through cables? And so in this dinky little warehouse, they constructed the flight, that basically the airplane, when everybody else was looking somewhere else, all based on intuition. So you gotta pay attention to those signals. And when you do, great things happen.
Oh, man, I swear. I tell you what, my intuition is fired up right now. Like, you don't, my thing is this. I don't have, I don't do interviews like this or have conversations like this and stay the same. So now it's like my intuition is just like, as I'm just listening to you talk, I'm like fired up. Like, oh, I can't wait because now I'm going to trust me again. And, when I ask you the question, how do you learn how to trust yourself again? That's a great question, but it's also for me too, just learning how to trust myself again. And man, you touched on so much, and I want to thank you. But one thing I didn't get to ask you was why the title of your book, Fail Fast, Succeed Faster. What made you select that title? What did you have that same instant download break that down for us, please?
Yeah, and so the I was actually told that book was going to be a failure because nobody wanted to talk about failure. Everybody wanted to talk about success. And the one thing that everybody who knows me it knows is that you never say no to me until I can prove that that's a no. And so when I looked at the people that I've helped, the businesses that I've helped as a coach, at that time I was a consultant, they had their failures, right? And so failures is an absolute great thing to have. Even today, if you fail, don't forget your experiential intuition saying, I love that, because now there's a data point for me to put in the subconscious area of the brain so that if you make that decision again, I'm going to warn you. So failure is great. And so what I wanted to do is saying, sure, if you want to fail, failure is going to be, business is part of hurdles and failure. But what I want you to do is fail fast, because when you get rid of that, here's some stories that are going to get you to succeed faster. And so that was the premise of the book. And that's when I had Fail Fast, Succeed Faster, it was doing that. I had a number of friends around and we pitched another number of ideas. And here's what happens when you're in a crowd of intuitive people who are all in sync. We're going through a bunch of different, and I can't remember some of the names. And then, my wife, highly intuitive, she says, fail fast, succeed faster. And the room just stops talking. And that was it. It just resonated with everybody. So now if you take that into a corporate role, when you are a leader that's very intuitive, that's how you resonate with your team, because they know that you're making an intuitive decision. Everybody's like on board and they say, wow, yep. And so I'm going to use my talent to make that happen, to develop that product, to develop that service, to do that marketing, to bring in that customer. So that same analogy of me coming up with that title of a book is exactly what you feel when teams are all in sync. And that's the work that I do to make sure that happens.
This was just one of those interviews where it's like, I think I know how it's going to go. Then I have no idea how we got to this point towards the end. And I love it. I love when I have a guest on the show that just makes me because I have a whiteboard right here and I'm about to just completely scrub everything off and just let my brain do exactly what it needs to, because now it's like my imagination is just so sparked to just trust my intuition again, because, I've been wrong. I don't want to say I've been wrong more than I've been right. I think it's somewhat even at this point in my life. Mm-hmm. But I believe, failure, man, you can learn so much from failure. But my confidence, and this is something we could talk about too, my confidence has actually come more from my own failures than my own success. Mm-hmm. Because, failing for me has shown me what not to do and how not to do it. I've studied that so much. I can use sports, whether it's football, baseball, basketball, they're always studying film. They see what they've done wrong. Same thing with me, even with bad podcast episodes that I've done. I went back and I listened to it, and to be honest, it's kind of cringy sometimes, but I had to sit there and learn how to get better at my craft, right? How to study. And failure is great. And I'm excited. Yeah, I got to get your book. I got to get your book. I need a signed copy of your book, by the way. Fail Fast, Succeed Faster. Love it. The fact I see gut. Can you talk about the difference in gut versus fail fast and succeed faster?
Yep. So Fail Fast, Succeed Faster was the one about the stories of failure. And so when I started to dig deep into, okay, so what is this thing called intuition, right? And so when I reflected back on my life, and this is what a story I didn't tell, is that when I looked at the times, obviously when I trusted my intuition, I told you about raising the $200. But when I ignored my intuition, I got into engineering. The second time I ignored my intuition, when I had a contract in Silicon Valley, lots of money thrown at me in this contract. And I said, oh man, I gotta take this. But the contract terms were changing, and my intuitive signals were saying, you should ignore this. And I ignored that. I ignored my intuitive signals, went down to Silicon Valley, and they didn't pay me. And I came back broke. But perhaps the one incident that got me to right gut was that I had this friend of mine who was reaching out to me to get some advice. I was doing some personal coaching. I went in engineering, and she was being stalked by some guy, and she wanted some advice from me. And I basically allowed two of my buddies to say, hey, listen, let's go for beers. Even though my intuition at that time was nudging me to say, man, you better spend some time. She needs you now. This is an emergency. You need to meet with her this afternoon. And I ignored that signal. And I went out for beers, and I asked her, do you mind if we meet a couple of days later? And like a good friend, she said, yeah, sure. I think it can wait. And the very next day, that same guy, that stalker, walked up to her at a bus shelter and put a bullet through her forehead. And it was at that point when I started thinking about that incident. I said, I really need to dig deep into the science of intuition. And gut became, okay, we have these things called voices from God and manifestation. And it's great that people define that, but what's the science to it? And there's a lot of science in terms of MRIs, and the parts of the brain get lit up, the 4 types of intuition, the intuitive signals. So that's what got me to take a deep dive into the complexity of intuition. And so in that book, each component of intuition is paired with a story of someone who shows that component in action. So it's just not just sort of the theory behind what I think, but here's someone that actually shows that in their real life, from people from all walks of life, all different industries, all personal and professional, but you get a really good sense of the complexity of intuition through the eyes of everybody that you probably have met through the characters I have in that book. And so that's gut. And then I went on tour with that book, and then that basically led to intuitive branding, because now I started to put all those concepts into action. And I've got testimonial upon testimonial of people who've added $200,000 to their business, $100,000. I had someone who was almost a murder victim after her boyfriend murdered somebody in the bathtub. She walks into the apartment. He closes the door behind her, says, I'm already going away for one murder. Might as well make it 2, puts a knife to her neck, assaults her multiple times. Her intuition keeps her alive. She escapes. And she's so afraid of leaving her apartment. And then we meet. And I got her to trust her intuition. And she's now launched a book, a bunch of blogs, and she's now making $20,000 to $30,000 from an incident from a place where she couldn't even peep out her door, because she's trusting her intuition. That's the stuff that I do. That's the transformation that I do in terms of what guts help people to do, putting into action, and helping more people finally live the life that they want to, on their own turf, their own rules, how they want, and who cares about anybody else, because their intuition is there for them, not anybody else. And that's what I help them do.
Man, I'm sorry about that. That was man, that is crazy, man. That is just, man, I'm like at all with that one, man. I'll be quite honest with you. But it's like, I'm sorry to cut you off, but
yeah, that's okay.
I get this feeling of, I don't want to imagine you like a superhero, but yeah, it's like you being a Marvel superhero, and that for you is what unlocked your superpower. And now it's like, now you can't ignore that ever again.
Absolutely. And it's just, you know what, it's just trusting those signals to reach out to help that person. And time again, people's lives change. And I'll give you a couple quick examples. One, someone had heard or listened to my podcast through her friend, and never known about intuition all her life. And she's homeless 3 times. She had 3 kids, lived in her car. And so never trusted intuition, or she thought she didn't understand what intuition is until she listened to my podcast interview, and then now started to understand about these signals. And so she listens to the podcast at 2:00 in the afternoon. And then a couple of hours later, about 4:00, she gets this signal to go onto her Facebook account. Now, she never logged into her Facebook account for 2 years. And she says, okay, I've got something telling me to go onto Facebook. She opens up her phone, goes onto Facebook, logs in, and there's a picture of her ex-boyfriend with her 14-year-old daughter surrounded by drugs and alcohol. She phones the police. They get the post taken down, and they get him arrested. And by midnight, her 14-year-old daughter is back in her arms. And the very next day, I get an email thanking me for basically saving her life and her daughter's life. And another incident was I was watching this Instagram video with Prince EA. He's got a lot of great motivational stuff. And I was just, sometimes I like to scroll through the comments, and I somehow stopped this. For some reason, my intuition got me to stop on this. It says, I need to talk to someone now. And I found at his account, that account, I didn't know if it was a he or she, reached out, DM'd that account and said, I know you need to talk to someone. What's going on? So we hopped on a call, and this was a guy who was a 20-year welder, lost his job, was divorced, couldn't find a job even pumping gas. And he was on the verge of taking his life. And in the next 45 minutes to an hour, I got him to first acknowledge his intuitive signals. And then I got him to say, what are you passionate about? So this 20-year-old welder was passionate about fishing. And so what I said is, okay, here's a business model for you. Go shoot some fishing videos because you love doing it anyways. And you're telling me you've got some secrets on how to get bigger bass and how to look at the weeds and this and that. I'm not a fisherman. I have no clue about this stuff. But what if you shot these videos and got these really good tips and go to all the these companies that are selling rods and lures and all that, and get affiliate payments? So if I have your rod featured, why don't you give me 25% of those revenues, et cetera, et cetera. So he went from someone who was about to take his life to now developing a plan to start a YouTube channel. And we touched base 3 months later. And he said, first of all, my daughter is so proud of me as a father. And that's all that matters to me. I don't care about the success in the world or how my channel's doing, or what have you. But my daughter loves me. That's the power of intuition. And that's what happens when you connect with people at an intuitive level. And that's what happens when you run your life based on intuition, because then you can connect with all these people rather than having your head buried in doing things because other people want you to do, or that's what society wants you to do, or you're not happy with yourself and you don't want to make changes. And these are tough decisions. And, it kind of circles back to our original discussion about why people don't want to change. Because they say change is hard, but when I do things that I do, I'm going to piss off some people. People don't understand what I'm doing. People don't think that this is the right thing to do. I don't care. I'm living every single day based on my purpose, my intuition, and I teach my kids about intuition all the time. And so if you look at the artwork behind me, I've got 2 paintings here. That artwork is done by my 14-year-old daughter, who at the ripe age of 12 years old, trusted her intuition to say, I want to help those with disabilities and illnesses feel special because I do when I create art. And I'm telling her that this has to come from you. Your intuition is to tell you what to do. And 6 months later, after a trip to India, she saw these photos. And she goes, Dad, I'm going to do it. I know. I'm going to start a nonprofit business. I'm going to paint and I'm going to sell my paintings, and I'm going to bring all these disabilities and illness, people with disabilities and illness together, and raise money so they can paint for free. And in 2 years, she's raised over $30,000. And all because of intuition. She has her own website. She has her own podcast show. And then my younger daughter, who's 10 now, last year, she said, Dad, I want to do something like my sister. And it's always about giving back. And so she's learning to sing, and one of her idols is Taylor Swift, and she loves to read. So I said, well, combine your passions together, because when you're passionate about life, you make changes. And so she says, okay, Dad, I know. I'm going to design bookmarks. It's not coming from her. This is a 9-year-old telling me I'm going to design bookmarks. And because Taylor Swift has spent her time donating her time to help sick kids in hospitals. I'm going to donate the money from my bookmarks to raise money for sick kids in hospital in Toronto. And so my wife and I said, okay, you're 9. If you're serious, you need to raise $500. So we figured we have about a year, 5 days. She made a few phone calls. She actually did 2 pitches on Zoom, one with my buddy and another with a podcast interviewee of mine who said, oh, I want to listen to your daughter's pitch. And so she pitched him for about 10 minutes. He gave her $100. 5 days, $500. And so now we're in the process of getting her website and a nonprofit status. And her goal this year is 10,000 because she just turned 10. And I have no doubt she's going to raise that. All that comes from a sense of purpose, a sense of confidence, listening to your signals, not allowing people to say no. Who cares about it? Society says the same philosophies that we have that we're talking about actually have become practical. And this is the change that you make in the world. So we can all talk about philosophy and nod our heads and talk amongst ourselves like this in a podcast. But if you do not take action, think about what happened to Vin Jiang. It's twice your life that you're wasting. And why do you want to waste life at 60, 70, 80 when you're on your deathbed? Why do you want to even regret what you didn't do tomorrow? Make the change today by trusting your intuition.
Make the change today. Sunil, I want to thank you again for stopping by on a podcast and sharing so much value, being so vulnerable, and just leading. Definitely want to thank you again. For the listeners, like Sunil said, what good is information if we don't apply it? Apply things that we've learned. There's so much that we could apply. And just paying attention to that intuition, being conscious, being aware, being in the moment, not necessarily living in the future, but being present in your life matters. So like always, I want to thank you guys for listening or streaming or maybe watching this, any of you, wherever you are right now. I'll catch you guys in the next episode. Like always, what good is information if you don't apply it? Apply what you learned today. Man, this was so good. Thank you again for stopping by.